Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox checking in with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, one of the things I've been thinking about, writing about, and talking about is why compliance may matter even more. Here we are in the first 6 weeks of the Trump administration. I was really gratified to see that you and your Bostonian colleagues were talking about that at a recent event, and you wrote about it in a blog post. So I thought we might explore some of the things you heard or that struck you from that event.
Sure, I can just tell everybody a background about what that event actually was. This was basically a panel discussion of compliance professionals hosted by Suffolk University Law School here in Boston. And they had four compliance speakers. Two were compliance officers from large tech companies that have substantial presences here in New England. One was the head of compliance for a multi-state credit union in the Northeast, and they're also based in Boston. And then the fourth speaker was a private law firm lawyer, a partner at a law firm, who handled outsourced compliance and legal issues and questions for small tech startups. He focused specifically in healthcare, but we have an awful lot of small tech startups in New England, and many of them are too small for a dedicated compliance officer and they need help. So they would go to local law firms. And this was one of the partners there. So it was a panel of four, and they were talking about how compliance has or has not changed, even just in the first month, 6 weeks of the Trump administration. And Tom, we can get into why this is, but I was really struck by how all four basically said at the end of the day, in one way or another, it hasn't really changed what we do all that much. And maybe there will be changes over the long course of the next 4 years, but they might be incremental over time. But anybody who's thinking like there's going to be a big bang change in how companies think about compliance and compliance programs, the duties you need, the importance of ethics and integrity, they all basically said no, that's not really going to change. And they don't see any of that changing at their businesses for various reasons. But it was striking to get that sort of impression from such a wide range of compliance people.
Matt, that was one of the key takeaways I got from your blog post. And I think if this had been 2010 and Trump had made the announcements he's made so far, we might not be having a podcast in 2025. But by now, compliance is truly embedded into the business operations of most organizations. And indeed, what I got from your blog post was, guys, these are just regular business decisions we're making that compliance is a part of. And whether it was for vendor risk, whether it was demonstrating to a potential customer we have an adequate data protection compliance program, whether it was demonstrating we as a vendor are a acceptable risk for your organization within the parameters of what you're willing to accept. I saw a business process embedded into an organization and almost embedded into the thought processes of how an organization would actually do business, whether it was a vendor, whether it was a hospital, or whether it was something else.
And that came up in various ways, but essentially, yes, we need to consider not just how a company is complying with regulations laid out by the government, which is still there and still substantial, and we can get back to that later on in this discussion. But a lot of the discussion at that panel last week was more about how compliance capabilities are also very important for a company dealing with other companies, whether those are your customers or your vendors or whatnot. And at that point, I don't know where the line is between the importance of an ethics and compliance program versus a vendor risk management program, or are they essentially merging into the same? And I'll give you an example of what I mean. This came from that lawyer who works with small tech startups, that he said that he will often encounter a client who is a small tech firm. They might have wonderful technology, and now they want to go and sell it to a larger corporate customer. And here in New England in healthcare, that would probably be somebody like Mass General Hospital or Harvard University and its medical school, or some other big, hefty customer like that. And he basically said, bidding to win those customers is a brutal process. And for any vendor knocking on their door. There are going to be about 20 different executives looking at that proposed contract from that small vendor, and all of them are looking for some way to say, no, I don't want to do it. Doesn't matter that you're great on the finances, doesn't matter that you're great on the tech. A lot of the, no, we don't want to do this is all about, can we trust you as a vendor in our larger extended enterprise? And that gets to issues of cybersecurity. It gets issues to privacy. It gets to issues of business conduct. And if a company can't answer those questions well, the larger corporate customer is going to say, I don't want you in my house. And they're going to keep the door closed. Another way to think about it, and this is the thing that stuck with me a lot, Tom, is that if we were talking just to listeners at large corporate employers today, right now, listening on this podcast, if I started saying you needed to have a strong vendor risk management program, every single compliance officer would say, yes, absolutely, we do. We need to assess our vendors for this and this. Your vendor risk management program is the vendor's enterprise risk program. The two things are one and the same. You're grappling with the same problems, looking at them from opposite directions, but it's the same stuff. So what is a strong vendor risk management capability for a Fortune 500? That is somebody else to meet those demands needs to have a strong enterprise risk and compliance program internally, because it's all about gearing up the evidence to show that you have your ducks in order. In order to do what? Anything. To comply with the law, to not bribe a contract, to have strong cybersecurity, to be financially stable. We could go on and on. Ethics and compliance are one part of that. There are many other parts, but now the business need for strong vendor risk management means, since we are all somebody else's vendor, we are all somebody else's third party, you need a strong program to show those customers that all of your ducks are in a row, that you do act with integrity, that your cybersecurity is in place, you do understand your privacy obligations. So it gets back to that strong compliance is a good business imperative because your customers are looking for this too.
Matt, in listening to your answer, two things struck me. Number one is we often talk about various stakeholders. That could be a customer, that can be internal employees, it could be a shareholder, it can be a location where you're doing business, it can be your third parties. But you really focused on the internal stakeholders, meaning all of those who have to approve a purchase. And you can certainly have, and let's keep with the data, with the small vendor going to the hospital, they have to have a data protection program. The CISO may be very interested in that, but the CFO may be interested in what are the financial results going to be delivered. The CCO may be interested in something else. There could be multiple internal stakeholders who have to approve, and perhaps not that they are all looking for a reason to say no, but they all may be looking at something different that you as a vendor have to be ready, willing, and able to respond to with transparency. The second thing that struck me is God bless America. On March 4, 2025, we levied tariffs of 25% on our two biggest trading partners. How do you assess that as a vendor risk? Let's stick with the medical care business in New England. And you, of course, named the hospitals in and around the Boston area. They may not know what their risk is going to be because of a Mexican or Canadian tariff or a retaliatory tariff. And so it may put even more pressure on your vendor risk management program to assess risks you hadn't thought of on March 3rd.
That's all true. I am going to dodge the tariff question because everybody else in corporate America right now, I have no idea how we're going to handle these tariffs. They're going to be a nightmare for various reasons, although you do have to start thinking about things like diverted products, black market sourcing. Yes, that is now going to be a thing. If you are buying syrup for the office cafeteria, are you sure that this syrup did not come from Canada? Was it smuggled in across the border? I had a grandfather who was involved in smuggling whiskey in back in the 20s. So who knows, maybe it's in my genes. I could start smuggling the syrups.
Was that part of the gang?
Kelly gang. I will bring it back to some of the more tangible stuff. We've talked an awful lot about privacy and cybersecurity. I know there's a lot of ethics and compliance officers who say that's cool, but That's not really me. I'm still worried a lot about anti-corruption. Let me give you an example of how this still will endure right now. You are still maybe going to wind up looking to acquire a business target or do business with some joint venture partner somewhere else. Maybe they're going to be corrupt. Do you need to worry that, oh Lord, we have a corrupt merger target and now the Justice Department might land on us with both feet if we don't correct this? Maybe to a lesser degree. Let's be honest. There's a pause in FCPA enforcement. Donald Trump clearly hates the FCPA, but there's a difference between we need to come clean and have a big investigation and go through a resolution. That might be less likely, but you absolutely still want to know, who is this merger target? Are they engaged in corruption? If they are and we acquire them, we're not going to turn a blind eye to the corruption. We're going to figure it out. We're going to correct it somehow. Maybe you don't necessarily need to report it, but fundamentally, you still need an ability to assess, who is this target? Are they corrupt? How are they corrupt? How did that corruption happen? What are the internal controls that were not in place? And now we're going to have to go in and fix them so that at the very least, we know what that merger target, this new subsidiary of ours, is going to do. So in many ways, a lot of the compliance skills that you needed to have because you were worried about enforcement, you still need to have to worry about good business operations. None of that has changed. And Tom, I'll go back to what one of these panelists at the Suffolk event told me, or told the audience, that was striking. He said, yeah, Donald Trump got elected. I still get 90 emails a day from people across my enterprise who need an answer to some compliance thing, and I need to answer them right now. And I think he's right. I think a lot of compliance officers would take his point that clearly the world's changed since Donald Trump came in, not necessarily for the better, but does that actually mean any compliance officers right now have less work to do, that you are twiddling your thumbs? I haven't heard that from any compliance officers. They are still struggling. They're still way overworked. And there are still a lot of assurance needs that the management team wants that you are inexorably pulled into providing. And I don't know if that's going to change at all. And that's true whether we're talking about tariffs, anti-corruption, cybersecurity, or probably a lot of other stuff.
Matt, there was another component to or two more components to your blog post. You tied them together. I may take them a little bit separately. The first is, who are we? And I thought that was a great question posed about, who are we as an organization? What do we stand for? Are our values still the same after January 20th? Has something changed? And the second part of the question, though, was around the small financial advisory. I couldn't tell if he was a CCO or just someone in compliance in a small financial advisory firm. And you talked about, or he related, rules that have been proposed under the prior administration's. The rule was in the comment period so that there had been commentary, but no finalization of the rules.
Mhm.
He wasn't sure which rules would become effective, if any, and was trying to think through that. And that really, Matt, brought for me a broader conversation about why compliance needs to have the ability to manage a variety of risks that may appear or disappear, or that aren't known. And so you have to have the flexibility within your own compliance program to assess the risk and then manage it if it becomes a risk. So you tied those together quite nicely, but if you want to take them disparately, then put them together for me, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll take them one at a time, and I'll start with the who are we as a company, which was a very interesting discussion because the panelists all said that integrity is still an important variable to pay attention to for corporations. And ultimately, to a certain extent, that's not a question for the CCO. That is a step above your pay grade. It is up to the board and management to decide how important is integrity to who we are as a business. And from that decision, you, the compliance team, then figure out some of the more practical challenges or requirements to uphold that integrity. For example, let's go back to the merger and the anti-corruption reviews, the example that I mentioned a few minutes ago. You're going to perform due diligence on a merger target. and you find that maybe there's an issue? Or to what extent are you able to perform due diligence on this merger target at all? That really depends on how much management says integrity is important to our business, rooting out corruption is important. We want to make sure it doesn't get into the house. From that standard, either it's very high, and therefore, compliance officer, you get to do pre-acquisition due diligence. You get to come up with an integration plan. Let's not forget, even before Trump, the Justice Department was actually becoming quite forgiving of M&A issues in FCPA enforcement. And so long as you cleaned up the act, you're probably going to get a very favorable resolution. So maybe you don't need to worry about that. But to what extent do you want to worry about corruption as something that the company just doesn't like? That is a decision for the board, and it's a decision that senior management make. And then they tell you. But if they come to you and say, what should we be doing? You, the compliance officer, have to sort of diplomatically put that question back onto management. It depends. How much do you really care about integrity and ethics in the business? If you care about it a lot, here's what we will have to do. If you don't really care about it a lot, here's what we don't need to do. Here are all the consequences that could potentially happen. And if you management are okay with that, then we will proceed. Tread carefully, compliance officers, because we always like to say the business unit owns the risk. That's essentially what I just said that you could convey to management. I have noticed that when the risk then bites the business in the rear end, they have a funny habit of turning around to the compliance team and saying, how did you let this happen? We didn't let it happen. We managed the risk to your specifications, and you, business, were the ones dumb enough to say, our expectations are so low, our risk tolerance is so high. What else did you think was going to happen to your rear end except you'd have a bite in it? And that is a conversation that you need to think through before you have it, but then ultimately you need to have it. So there's that. And then, Tom, your second point that you raised, this was a very good question from a financial advisory type in the audience who said that the Biden administration, SEC, had put out a lot of proposed rules for public comment. Public comment has been submitted, and these rules are now somewhere in the creation process. However, in the Trump administration, I think somewhere in the creation process probably means the deep freeze. And are we talking 100 below zero or absolute zero? I don't know, but I'm hard pressed to believe a lot of these rules are going to come to fruition sometime soon. But the advisor there who was curious is, what am I supposed to do? Because I know these rules might come out. I know they might not come out. And what am I supposed to tell my management team about which ones we prepare for? The panelists talked a lot, again, about who are you as a company and which of those rules, if they come to pass, would align with what your core values are, what your priorities are, and worry about those first. My take, and I wasn't on the panel, and I didn't get to go talk to this guy afterwards, but if I had, what I would have told him was think more about what are your biggest risks as a company? What does management worry about as a company? And which of these proposed rules that may or may not ever see the light of day or be thawed out from the deep freeze, which of those come closest to addressing your big risks? Start worrying about those first. If you have strong risk management capabilities that align with the biggest risks you worry about, you're probably going to be in the ballpark of where these regulations come forth anyways. Then if they eventually do, you'll be in better shape to comply with the specific rule because you'd already been thinking about the risks that you're worried about and trying to build a strong risk management capacity. We're going to need to think a lot more, Tom, I would say, about your capacity to manage risks and to assess risks and define the risks that are most pressing and how those do or don't align to the regulatory obligations that might come forward or that already are. But if you can bring those two into alignment, suddenly compliance is going to get a lot easier, even in this topsy-turvy world we are currently in.
Matt, it really sounds like it was a fascinating discussion. And I hope our listeners will take away from at least this podcast that compliance is not going away, but it's not going away for a variety of reasons. And hopefully we can continue this conversation about the importance of embedded compliance in your business operations and your overall management of risk going forward.
Thank you, Tom.